Hi, everybody. My name is David Lovell, and wonderful to see so many people online here today. And to begin, I want to acknowledge the First Nations owners of the lands on which we're standing here, which is the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I want to acknowledge and pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creative spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of research and learning. So when it comes to NAIDOC Week, which is really a great celebration of achievement of First Nations people, and we're here on lands which have always been home to research and learning, I can't think of a much better way to celebrate than by hearing from an emerging scholar who brings rich perspectives to important questions. Becki Cook is a Nunukul woman and PhD candidate here at QUT, and has done great things for QUT in her time here, including through helping the Centre for Data Science run and function. And it's been a real delight to get to know Becki. And as a scholar, one of the things that I appreciate most is the way that Becki asks important questions and has a real spirit of inquiry, listening and learning and understanding. And we need more of that. So it's an absolute treat, Becki, to welcome you today, and also to pay tribute to your tremendous technical achievements in making the audio and video working. So well done on that count. I'm going to switch now to you, and are you good to commence?
Yes. Yes, I am. I'm just going to switch the video back to myself. So thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for coming along this morning and joining the seminar. And thank you, David, for providing an acknowledgement of our traditional owners where we're meeting here today, QUT. So the Turrbal and the Yagara are the First Nations owners of the land where QUT campuses now stand. I'd like to acknowledge their customs, creation spirit, laws, elders, and extend respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us here today. I'd also like to acknowledge my Nunukul ancestors and the Kumbamerri people as well, whose lands I've lived on my entire life. So we are running a hybrid talk this morning, so please bear with us if we do have any technical difficulties, and thanks for those people coming along in the room as well. So just a bit of an overview of this morning's session. I'm just going to give you a little bit more of an introduction to myself and how I've come to be here today. We're going to touch on Indigenous data, definition and some historical use around Indigenous data, which is highlighting why some of these issues around Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance are important, not only for researchers, but for anyone who's using data to make decisions. I will go on to define Indigenous data sovereignty and why it's important, and also Indigenous data governance, and talking about some data rights and principles and practice around Indigenous data governance. And going to also cover some strategies that researchers can adopt when they're undertaking research with First Nations peoples. Also touch on ethical considerations and practices. And we'll end with some Q&A, so feel free to ask questions in the room, and if you're online, pop them in the Q&A or chat function, and we will get to those at the end. Nice to meet you all. For those people who don't know me, you know, we have got some photos of people who I know are in the room and online. As David mentioned, my name is Becki Cook. I'm a Nunukul woman. So my family's traditional country is Minjerribah or North Stradbroke Island. I was born down the Gold Coast on Kumbamerri country. I've been working in the higher education space now for about 10 years. And before that, I was working as a high school science teacher and working in high schools as well. So improving outcomes for Aboriginal people within education and learning spaces has always been really important to me and been an interest of mine. And I just, the pictures that I've got here, just wanted to, some key, I guess, parts of myself that I wanted to share. So the one on the left, myself and Dr. Jen Campbell, this was the first conference presentation that I ever did, which was in Hawaii, which was really exciting. We got to talk about pathways into higher education. I've got some family in the middle photo out at NAIDOC Week. And also Dr. Stephen, who's been a mentor of mine and supporting me in my research for many years now. Okay, so before I jump in and speak about data, I just wanted to, sorry, about Indigenous data, I just wanted to take a moment and to think about what data might mean to you and what type of, when you hear the word data, what do you think about? What types of things actually pop up in the forefront of your mind? And, you know, having worked in the Centre for Data Science for a few years now, probably have a bit of an idea about some of the types of data that people use and things like that. And so I just wanted to take a step back and just these definitions that I've popped up here, I literally did a Google search, popped in, what does data mean? And the first thing that popped up was facts and statistics collected together for reference or analysis from the Oxford Dictionary. And then on the other side of my screen was the Wikipedia summary, which, you know, we like a good Wikipedia. But, you know, I think Wikipedia can be good because it's kind of a general thought on a particular topic because people can go in and change it. So in common usage, data are a collection of discrete or continuous values that convey information, describing the quantity, quality, fact, statistics, other basic units of meaning, or simply sequences of symbols that might be further interpreted formally. I also went on to type in research data to see if I could get a different definition, but there weren't any dictionary definitions that popped up. However, the Uni of South Australia talks about research data as any information that has been collected, observed, generated, or created to validate original research findings. And Deakin Uni had a definition saying all data collected, observed, or created by researchers in the course of their work for the purposes of analysis to produce original research results. And I thought, you know, research data starting to provide a bit of a bigger picture, thinking about things in a bit more of a different way. And I think having that lens is really important when we do consider Indigenous data. So what actually constitutes Indigenous data? When considering this, we must do so in a way that also incorporates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ways of being, knowing, and doing. And this definition that I've provided here, while it is lengthy, it has been created through community consultation with experts across the Indigenous Data Network. And it's for use within Australia when considering data related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's very specific, which is purposeful, and it's important, especially when we are considering Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. I'm going to read it because I know it's a little bit hard to see on our screen here in the room that we're in as well. So data generated intentionally or not by, about, or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Indigenous data refers to information in any format or medium collected, analysed, stored and interpreted within the context of Indigenous individuals, collectives, populations, entities, lifeways, cultures, knowledge systems, lands, biodiversity, water and other resources. It includes data collected, used or stored by any agency, department, laboratory, organisation, corporation, statutory body, university or research institute, conducted by, with and about Indigenous people or peoples, and data that Indigenous communities have generated and maintain themselves. And I think it's really important because you're starting to see with the image here that it is much more than numbers, you know, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our culture is very rich and traditionally an oral culture. And so the stories and images and things that have been passed down for millennia are very important. It's going to happen. And the definition of Indigenous data in this way is also very important when we consider historical collection and use not only within Australia, but also across other colonised countries. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have complex knowledge systems that have developed over many millennia, Our people have used these knowledges or data to effectively support health and well-being of communities and countries for thousands and thousands of years. It's also acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are considered to be the most researched culture globally. Often data was collected about individuals and communities without consent or the proper ethical protocols, and without consideration on the purpose or benefit to the community from the data that was being collected. Data about Indigenous peoples is also collected and held by organisations and institutions. And together with some of these poor ethical practices, this has meant that while there's a lot of data collected about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it's often difficult for communities to have access to that data that's being collected, that has been about them, and it could be data that they might need to make important decisions within communities. Deficit data is also a huge issue because it portrays Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples negatively and potentially as a problem that might need to be fixed. It can overshadow some of the positive outcomes that communities have and reduce complex issues into simplistic failure narratives. Unfortunately, this is often the type of data that's used to inform government policies, and it does not recognise the strengths and capabilities or enable solutions, which might ultimately improve socioeconomic outcomes. I've included the population count here from the most recent census just to remind us that even if we aren't specifically looking at Indigenous data, we might still have data sets or information that includes Indigenous data from 3.2% of the population. So it still might be important around considerations around Indigenous data sovereignty. And there's also, we know there's a saying that, if it's good for mob, it's good for everyone. So considering some of these things can have huge benefits across research. Considering Indigenous data in the context of research is important. Coming along to this seminar, I'm sure you also have an appreciation for the power of data and its impact on society. Indigenous data can play a crucial role in preserving, revitalising languages, traditions, and cultural practices. Examples might include digital archives of oral histories, traditional ecological knowledges, and cultural artefacts. Data can provide critical insights into the social, economic, and health challenges that are faced by Indigenous communities. And by having control over our data, communities can better identify needs, allocate resources, and develop targeted interventions. Health data can reveal patterns and trends in diseases, leading to more effective health programs and services. Economic data can help in developing programs within communities for sustainability and support community development and self-sufficiency. Educational data can also guide the creation of culturally relevant curriculum and support services that enhance educational outcomes. And empowerment can be through data governance, shifting towards Indigenous-led research and providing communities with access to data that can be used to advocate for rights and influence policymakers. So on to some definitions. So the definition of Indigenous data sovereignty, it refers to the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. This concept emphasises that Indigenous communities should have control over how their data is used, shared, and managed, and ensuring that data practices respect cultural values, governance structures, and priorities. It aims to protect Indigenous knowledge and promote self-determination by ensuring that data collection and use benefit the communities. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous Peoples also affirms these rights, and the rights to control data are weaved throughout many of its 46 articles. So Indigenous data sovereignty is important, but in thinking about its importance, it's also to remember that Indigenous data sovereignty is a concept at its core, and it emphasises the autonomy of Indigenous communities in data management. Having authority over how data is collected, stored, and used can ensure that data practices respect and uphold Indigenous cultural values and governance mechanisms. Indigenous data sovereignty is important as it is critical to self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It supports Indigenous peoples to make decisions about them and for their community. The inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the community, in the collection of data allows for proper protocols and practices to be followed, and it ensures that it's done in a respectful way that aligns with community views, practices, and priorities. It also ensures that the collected data is used in a way that reflects the community. It's a move away from the historical deficit narrative towards one of strength and solutions. It can put a stop to misuse of data and exploitation of knowledge and expertise. Indigenous data sovereignty can help protect and promote Indigenous knowledge, traditions, and culture. There is also potential for improved socioeconomic outcomes that meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So how is this actually put into practice? And this is where Indigenous data governance comes into play. So through Indigenous data governance mechanisms, and Indigenous data governance refers to the right of Indigenous peoples to autonomously decide what, how, and why Indigenous data are collected. It ensures that data on or about Indigenous peoples reflects our priorities, values, cultures, worldviews, and diversity. This requires Indigenous peoples to be involved throughout the entire data life cycle. Two mechanisms make up Indigenous data governance, and that is the governance of data and data for governance. And these work together and don't exist by themselves. The governance of data refers to how the decision-making around access and control and use, and is of particular interest to organisations like government agencies and other custodians that hold Indigenous data. Data for governance is about providing Indigenous peoples with the data that they require for decision-making, and also ensuring that within communities there is capacity to be able to use this in the way that is most beneficial. So just taking a moment to look at Indigenous people's rights within data, and these have been put together by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. This explains how rights and data can be upheld through the data for governance and the governance of data. So if we're thinking about communities, right to self-determination, to possess, to use, to consent, to refuse, and to reclaim data, and the right to govern data, to define data, for privacy, the right to know, right to association, and right to benefit from data that's being collected. So the CARE principles reflect the role of data in supporting Indigenous innovation and self-determination. They ensure that data movements like the open data movement, whatever they're advocating and pursuing, respect the people and purpose behind the data. The CARE principles describe how data should be treated to ensure that Indigenous governance over the data is used and respected. And CARE is an acronym for collective benefits for Indigenous peoples, so they should benefit from the data or the data ecosystem. A is authority to control, which recognises that Indigenous peoples have the right to control their data and that they should be empowered to do so. R, responsibility, so that anyone using Indigenous data has a responsibility to ensure that data is shared and used to support Indigenous self-determination and that data benefits Indigenous peoples. And E is for ethics, so Indigenous peoples' rights and wellbeing should be paramount at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. And these CARE principles complement the existing FAIR principles, which require data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So while the FAIR principles are about making it easier to share and reuse data, the CARE principles ensure that data is used ethically. So researchers, institutions, and policymakers can consider these elements to ensure that Indigenous data governance is effective and sustainable, and also benefit to the communities. Community engagement should be meaningful and ongoing, with the community engaged in the research early on and also kept up to date. This can ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and included. There could also be community consultations, workshops, and meetings which might gather feedback around research. Research goals should also be developed together. They should be transparent how that data is going to be used and shared. And in doing so, we can also think about how we might demonstrate to the community that the input into this process has actually been valued and included in the research. So these elements not only incorporate Indigenous data sovereignty, but also have potential to enhance the quality and impact of research that involves Indigenous data. Community should be supported to manage their own data, and this can be done by training programs, technical support, resource allocation, and also collaboration between researchers and communities on projects. If research is being used to inform policy, then it could be done in a way that represents community and their priorities. And any policies in relation to Indigenous data governance should also be developed in this way, so having that input from the community early on, ensuring that they reflect values and agendas that are of priority. Data sharing agreements should be clear and mutually agreed upon. All data governance policies should be also reviewed as appropriate and updated in an ongoing process. So if we consider these elements, there is potential to not only respect Indigenous data sovereignty, but also enhance the quality and impact of research that involves Indigenous data. So in reality, how can researchers do this? Well, one of the first things that we can do is to have research which is led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This means undertaking research that is co-designed with community and ensuring that community research leads to a genuine benefit for those it is about. And the only way we know what's beneficial is if we actually go out there and talk to people. So this could include consultation with community, elders, community members, relevant community organisations and stakeholders. Research agendas can also be co-created to address community priorities. And this ensures Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we can also ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are on the research project as part of the research team or involved throughout the data lifecycle. And this ensures that Indigenous perspectives are weaved throughout the process. And this might also provide opportunities for capacity building and where community have increased engagement with data. So working with community, pairing with community as researchers. Data collection should reflect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values. So we can consider if using Indigenous research methodologies might be appropriate, and could you collect data in a more culturally appropriate way. At this stage, you may also like to consider develop data sharing agreements and consider how you're going to be accountable and transparent with the communities on your findings and the data that's been collected. Are you considering if the data that you're going to be reporting tells the whole story, or are you only considering deficit data? In what way would you also consider incorporating community aspirations and positive outcomes in success stories? And any analysis and reporting and sharing of data should consider Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ways of knowing, being and doing, and making sure that findings are shared in a way that is actually usable. So are we just popping our research into a paper? Are we presenting it only on campus? Or are we going to get out there and make sure that people have access to our findings and so they can actually benefit from what we've been doing? I'm going to give you a brief example of a project which this week has been published, but it's been an ongoing piece of work. So just to give you an example of putting some of these strategies into practice, I'm going to briefly talk about this project, which was done in collaboration with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service, Brisbane. As I mentioned, this work's just been published this week, so we're very excited about this. We've got the co-authors here in the room in the Journal of Community Informatics. So if you want to know more about the outcomes, you're welcome to go look that up or tune into a seminar later on. So this project came about through discussions with the health service. And it was around seeking community feedback around data and capacity building. So we started out with an idea as researchers that we wanted to develop a data literacy framework. And this idea has actually evolved into the focus of my PhD. But this particular work was focusing on whether data literacy and enhancing data literacy was actually aligned with community value. So here, rather than jumping in with our original research aim, we took time to engage with community extensively around whether this was indeed a priority. We included Indigenous researchers on the team and adopted an Indigenous research design, which ensured that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's priorities and perspectives were considered in any of the responses and in the analysis. We talked to the community about how their data was going to be used. That was this particular project. And we shared findings back to the community through the health service and broadly through conference and publication. As I mentioned, we considered community engagement. Our focus of the research included considerations around capacity building, ethical considerations, and this included speaking with community members out there at events and things before we actually undertook any interviews or research around whether this project might be something that they were interested in. And we did utilise Indigenous research methodologies throughout the project. So just some other examples that I'll quickly mention. The MK study is an example of how data collected can be used to share for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. This study is a national longitudinal study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander wellbeing, and it's the largest longitudinal study of adults within Australia. And it was developed over many years with consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the data that's been collected is overseen by an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Governance Committee, and the community engagement remains an ongoing feature of this particular study. And so the team who collect this data want to ensure the data is made to make positive change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander wellbeing. So they do so to support, we've got a magic blind here in the room just going up. We might want to, sorry, just 1 second, if someone can just hit the button to go back down, so it'll be very bright. Thank you. Thank you. So having physical room technical issues, not actual PowerPoint issues, which is very interesting. Okay, so why I mentioned this one is because they're custodians of a large data set, and they want to make this available for people to be able to use that benefit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And they do have a data governance committee to ensure that proper protocols are in place around releasing that data. Another example I want to mention is the development of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Data Commons, which is a collaboration between the Indigenous Data Network and the Australian Research Data Commons. And the team are working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to determine their engagement with and aspirations for their data. A core aim of this project is to enhance Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research data capabilities by supporting and strengthening Indigenous social and technical research data architecture, bringing together key national stakeholders to collectively agree on a core set of Indigenous data governance principles and data for governance, which is applied to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research data, tools, and analytical methods. And this project seeks to ensure the cultural and ethical safety of data and individuals and communities from which the data is about. So there are a couple of examples you can go and look at further. Also just going to take a moment if you want to screenshot some resources that might be useful if you are considering research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and data. The top two are probably all very familiar with, so IATSA's Code of Ethics and the NHMRC Guidelines for Ethical Conduct and Research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. These are going to be mandatory documents that you'll likely need to refer to if you are completing any ethical applications. And if you're looking for some more resources around Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Indigenous Data Governance, NIA, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, has just released the framework for governance of Indigenous data, and that's around data which is collected in the public service and government agencies. The Global Indigenous Data Alliance, the Mayamnari Ringara Collective around Indigenous Data Sovereignty, the Australian Research Data Commons, and the Lewitch Institute has a data sovereignty discussion paper which has some resources for researchers and also for communities who are participants in research. There. So just in summary of some of these strategies, just consider Indigenous data governance and leadership from the outset if you can, and ongoing throughout the life cycle. And the only reason I say if you can is because a lot of us are using data which has already been collected. So thinking about how you can go back and perhaps look at some of those agreements or how that data might be used to be able to be shared back to communities. Having research that's led by Indigenous peoples, and that's not about necessarily having an Indigenous researcher as the lead on a project, but the leadership comes from the community. So by finding out what the priorities are through those conversations, to be able to undertake research which is actually beneficial and meets community needs. Respecting the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty throughout. So understanding that Indigenous peoples have the right to benefit from the data that's been collected, and considering that in the design and sharing of data that we have. Are there any opportunities to build capacity for participants or staff within organisations, as well as community around Indigenous data? Ensuring appropriate data security, privacy and access protocols. So we understand that it's important to keep that data secure, but how are we going to make sure that there is an ongoing benefit to communities if we have the potential to do so? Who can be contacted as a custodian of that data? And I know there's a lot of work going on. IATSIS is doing some work around capturing metadata and making sure that people have custodians they can go to some of these projects as well. And that's what the Data Commons project that I mentioned earlier as well. We'll have some of that information captured in the metadata for any of the information that's been collected. Ensure that there are appropriate data. We've done that one, apologies. Transparency and accountability. So considering how the data is going to be shared back to the communities. So in what ways can we make our findings more accessible, more relevant and more beneficial to those people that it was actually about? I'll pop up my mandatory reference slide of there. I'm more than happy to share that. And thank you and happy NAIDOC.
Fantastic. That was a treat.
Thank you.
I have always got questions. I've got a lot of them, but I would like to invite others who have questions also for Becki. If you're online, please put them in the chat. And yes, we will share the recording. So we'll let people know how that's done once it's up and available. But look, whilst people are thinking about particular questions, I want to get in first. One of the things that is a real challenge for all of us is to understand what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes. So once you do that, your awareness and your appreciation really grows. And I think there are so many things that you've spoken about where it would be wonderful if people were better able to understand, some of the experiences, some of the consequences of the way in which data about First Nations people has been handled or is being handled. Do you, for people who may know nothing, and I think a lot of people, are there any particular examples that you or other folks online or around the table here, but starting with you, Becki, are there any things that you would point us toward to sort of go, look, this will help you get a better understanding of some of the things that you might experience?
I think I was trying to pop your video up there and I did. My brain tuned out to the first part of your question. Apologies, but I caught up at the end there. So, and I think I've got the right video up on the screen now. I think the first thing that people can do is to look at the communities that they're in as the first place and think about what priorities or data is relevant to that particular area. There are so many communities that have been researched and have had data collected about them, but also find it very difficult to be able to access that for the future. So if we think about the way that research has been historically done and throughout time, I guess, people would go into communities perhaps without thorough ethical protocols, do research. They might film people. They might have audio recordings of stories or songs or dances, things like that they've captured historically. They've taken those away from communities. Perhaps that particular person, throughout our history and people being taken and moved around. So some of those stories might have been lost. Those people may have passed. The communities are wanting to reconnect with some of those stories or archives that exist. But some of them are locked up under the researchers. I don't know the top of my head, I've lost the term, but they're secured because of as ownership to the researcher until they release them. And I think that's one of the issues. There's a lot of resources out there, but there's the access to data and to archives and to things that have been collected. That is a piece of work which is going on, but it is something that needs to be considered. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Look, and on a similar line, Bridget Haley has, in addition to thanking you for an excellent talk, interested to understand, would you have any examples of data sets that have been reviewed and well aligned to the principles of sovereignty and governance that you described? Are there any particular examples that spring to mind?
I think for a lot of people, off the top of my head, apart from some of the practices I mentioned, like the MK study, and I know in Victoria, another organisation, the Europe Justice Commission, they have practices around the release of data there. Indigenous data governance is something that people are starting to consider now. And so data sets that are being collected now have an opportunity to be able to have some of these agreements and understandings in the collection of them. But I think there needs to be a bit more done in the way that we can look at some of this historical information that's been collected. And I know, here at the university, in a similar context, we're talking about Indigenous cultural intellectual property and around some of the items that might be used here for learning and teaching that people have had access to, and are now going back and looking at potentially how some of these agreements and things that we've got can actually be renegotiated with communities. And I think having a conversation with those communities around those data sets is the first thing that we can do. And we can do that with research that we've got now. We might have some of these agreements and things which have been agreed upon, but that doesn't mean we can't go back and renegotiate and look at things with a new understanding.
Yeah, great. Leah.
So the published paper, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could talk more about the community consultation and how that shaped the project going forward.
Yeah. So the question online, if you couldn't hear, was around the published paper and the community consultation that we undertook from that research. Fortunately, so myself and Stephen, who's here, we did a lot of that community consultation in the first place. And, we were in a very, I guess, as Indigenous researchers on the team, we kind of knew what was happening in the community. So that did give us an opportunity to get out there and speak to people. I know we spent a lot of time in a tent at NAIDOC Week in the rain, walking around, talking to people, going, hey, what do you think about data? Is this something that you're interested in? Do you want to know more about how you could improve understanding around data and things like that? And we did that before we actually did any interviews. So as part of the process for defining and designing the project, we had some of those conversations. We spoke extensively with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service around what, I guess, scope they had with the data that they've got, and also what they were hoping to see in the project. And that's obviously got really strong Indigenous community connection as well there. And so I think, we got out there and asked people some of these questions. Is this something you're interested in? Is this a priority to you? And the feedback we got from those events was yes. And so then we went forward and we kind of asked those questions in a bit more of a formal process throughout this paper. So this paper was really around capturing community interest and perspectives around data literacy, and whether people wanted to know more about data that was being collected about them and how they could have access to that and use that for their own decision making and health and wellbeing. And they were some of the findings, and so that's going to be the next next piece is putting some of that in. So I guess both the early on consultation and the paper is just trying to find out whether this is a priority.
So on the heels of that question, you and Stephen put in the hard yards to spend time and listen and understand what is important to others. We're in an era now where we're seeing data being used on an industrial scale. I just wonder, do you have any thoughts about the time that we are now well and truly in, when we're seeing data from so many different places, data about all manner of things, data about Indigenous people, about non-Indigenous people, about families, individuals, and things like that. As that use of data has been on a absolutely dizzying rise. Is that something that you've been thinking about? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, it's interesting. I think myself, I've been on this, journey about understanding how data can be used a little bit more since I started working in this space. And I think I'm really, it's really interesting for me to see the interest everywhere around data and people becoming, we interact with things through digital technologies so much more and on a rapid increase as well. And so people have a little bit more wariness around data that they're providing to different stakeholders and wanting access to that information that they've provided. And I think some of these skills and abilities and access is really important, and it's only going to get more important as we move forward. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's a huge topic, and as we've been seeing people who are reacting to ideas about very personal information, their faces and their voices. Suddenly, that's a few things that I've heard in the past have become a lot more real, and I think that what you've described in this presentation, in the work that you're doing, has very broad significance. And yeah, so I wonder about your thoughts about taking the work that you're doing and sort of using that as a really important foundation for data governance and sovereignty for everyone. Do you see things that carry through to that?
Yeah, I think, and what I'm seeing more of, and what we, I guess, as Indigenous people know, that there's vast diversity within our communities of different groups, and I think building capacity around data and data that people are accessing, providing, and using, that varies as well in different contexts. And I think what's really important and critical is that we have access and skills related to what we need. We don't need to know everything. There's always going to be someone who knows something else. And I think that's where we go back to having some of these conversations with people around different priority areas. But I think it has been very interesting to see the different changes and different realizations of data and the world that we're going into, but being mindful that every area has its own priorities, and that's why we can't really take a blanket approach to something like data literacy or even data governance. We need to talk to the communities about the data or about individual areas and priorities, which might sound like a really hard thing to do or a bit of a time-consuming thing to do, but it is really critical and important. And I do just want to take a moment just to think about that time that we do spend consulting with people. I know it can be really challenging around, we've got university timelines, we've got other deadlines, we've got funding timelines and things like that, but we have to take the time to do this properly, and it might take a little bit more time. And if you are going to work in this space, you need to be really strong in making sure that you create that time to do this and be respectful of different priorities within the community, because there might be different events happening. There might be sorry business. You might need to respect things that are going on, and that takes time, but it's worthwhile. And you have to be an advocate for that within this space if you are going to step into using Indigenous data or doing Indigenous research.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder. Looking around to colleagues in the room and looking around to colleagues online, we have a limited window of opportunity to quiz Becki here. So if you have further questions, yes, please.
So I suppose this is partly ties into the sort of the data literacy and community engagement. But I'm curious about whether there's anything, I guess, the research community can do to, I guess, engage and actually empower communities to pitch research. So they don't necessarily need to be researchers to have a research question. And kind of, is there anything that's happening in that space and actually engaging community to be able to kind of guide that resource or drive that research?
Yeah, definitely. I don't have an example that I can refer to off the top of my head, but that's absolutely one of the main things that people can do, and that's about highlighting those priorities from the community, and partnering with community to design research projects, to undertake research initiatives and things like that. There are people that are doing work, going out to different areas, visiting communities, archiving resources, designing projects and things like that. And I guess, yeah, it definitely needs to come that way. But yeah, and the only way you find out what people want to work on is by having some of these conversations or links or visiting. And so you do need to take a slightly different approach to doing research.
Thanks for that question. Kylie from the ARDC has asked your thoughts on the Australian public sector framework for governance with Indigenous data. Is there anything in particular that springs to mind for that? Sorry, this is like an exam question.
Yeah, I know. I didn't read through this morning. I'm sorry, Kylie. No, thank you. I think look, the public sector framework, you know, the governments have such a huge role to play with Indigenous communities, and so I think it's really important that we have this out there now. And look, I need to, honestly, to do your question justice, Kylie, I need to go back and have a look through it. Yeah, sorry.
Well,
I know the way that it was been designed from collaborations from people, and I think that's really a good approach. There are a lot of people involved in the development of that document. Yes, thank you. Yeah, feel free to have a look, and I can, if you want to email me, I can email you my thoughts.
Look, sort of building on that, you talked about the role of governments in shaping how we behave and the way we work and all the kinds of things we do. But we're here in an educational institution, so educators have or can have a very powerful role. Now, next week is O Week here, and I would value your advice and wisdom for DSB 100, Fundamentals of Data Science. What things would you think would be really good to highlight and emphasise and open people's eyes to as they're, you know, taking their first steps in data science?
I think, and look, without being familiar with the course content, having not done that course or been in the teaching space, no thank you. No thank you. PhD is enough university for me at one time. I think some of the considerations around different types of data might be relevant around you know, what actually constitutes data for different groups of people, because, and like I said, I don't know what you cover, but some of those definitions around data and how we're pulling things together as data scientists in the data science space, being mindful that there are different things which have been used as information and collected as information, and it might just not be going out and measuring something. You know, as data scientists, we might actually need to have conversations with people and listen to people and listen to about different types of data, because information has been shared in so many different ways throughout different cultures. And we need to have, I guess, an open mind in considering the way that we're managing different types of information. Is that useful?
That's
Knowing
really useful. Look, I mean, I have to say, I knew I was going to learn stuff from year seminar, but you've actually given me a whole bunch of ideas that I want to put into practice really quickly. We have some questions here from Elise Kenny. So Elise works in the student voice with student voice data, and for those of you who are not at QUT, student voice is the one of the vehicles by which we solicit feedback from students. So Elise asks, what recommendations would you have for handling data of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander QUT students?
I guess my first thoughts around that particular space would be in terms of the responses that are collected, is there anyone perhaps with a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander expertise who might see some of the responses from Indigenous students, because they might present responses in a different way to other students, in considering Indigenous perspectives and responses. But in terms of handling data too, is there a way that it is shared back to students that might be perhaps in a different format or a different medium that might make it a bit more culturally appropriate? But yeah, happy to have a conversation about that as well. Yeah.
I think that's at the heart of doing things better, is to have the conversation and listen and learn and try and understand better. So that's a wonderful response. We have a question from A1055197. I've got a question for this person. Loved your talk, Becki. Thanks for such an approachable and comprehensive overview of Indigenous data governance. What are your top three pieces of advice? Top three for new Indigenous researchers who would like to follow in your footsteps and work with Indigenous data in governance. So while you're thinking about that, I just want to ask A105, are you Mary? Mary, are you yourself
Mary,
an Indigenous researcher?
So I can jump in.
Yeah, jump in. So Mary can respond. But what are three things that you mentioned?
Do Indigenous researchers, I think. Oh, this is a tough one. What are three things I would like to know? As best you can, I think, try and find, I don't know if this is the right answer, but try and find maybe a mentor in the space. I've been really fortunate to work with some people. I have one here in the room who's shared a lot about research with me and their own research journey. You know, I'm happy to have a yarn with anyone as well, but I think people who've gone through working in research and doing PhDs and working in universities, we have, you know, a lot to share about our own experience, which I guess as any PhD student knows, it can be, or even research can be very isolating at times. And so hearing that other people have done similar things as you before can be really helpful. You know, I don't even know if Stephen remembers this, but when I was working in a previous role and you were doing your confirmation for your PhD, I hadn't even thought about doing my master's at this particular point, but Stephen came in and shared with me his presentation. It's like, this is what a confirmation is. This is what I've had to do. I don't know if you remember that conversation. But this is what he did. And I think I still remember that, you know, probably, you know, I don't know, 8 or 9 years later would have been 8 years, 7 years, 10 years. Okay, we've got 10 years over there. So, you know, I think connect with other Indigenous researchers is really important. don't doubt yourself, because you come into the space with a lot of knowledge and expertise within yourself as well that can be really important and relevant. And a third thing, oh, I don't have a third thing. I don't know. I've got two. I'll think of another thing later. Sorry.
There's one thing that I would add, which might not spring to your mind, is say connecting with other Indigenous researchers. But as a non-Indigenous researcher, it's been just tremendous to get to work with you and with Stephen and with others. And, you know, there's a real intellectual generosity about your approach. And that's just marvellous. And, you know, researchers it's tough. There's a lot of different challenges, but I think, you know, connecting with people who will encourage and support everyone, it is important, and it's wonderful. It helps raise understanding and awareness. So that would be something that I would say is really valuable. We're running up to time. We have time just for one more question, and that's from Manda, who is with Office Research Engagement, and what's the I? And Research Ethics and Integrity, Office of Research Ethics and Integrity. Sorry, that's my acronym challenge for the day. Other things that you think could be changed or done differently that would help ease some of the administrative burden of doing work in this space?
Administrative.
I'm
Is that
guessing,
for ethics or?
look, I'm guessing that, like, if someone wants to embark on working with Indigenous communities or addressing issues or, you know, researching into things which relate to data relevant to Indigenous communities at QUT and other university institutions, there's care is taken to make sure that that is done in a way that's you know, respectful and well considered. Having said that, the actual burden of, like, providing that information can be quite high, and so you've got this tension between wanting to encourage people to do, you know, good, useful, valuable, and well considered research. It's going to be a benefit, but then there's some hurdles to get in there. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about yeah, how that could be made better?
I guess, and I probably sound a bit repetitive, but, you know, we do have quite a strong group of Indigenous researchers here at QUT through the Kumba Institute, connected through that space. It might be worthwhile having maybe some consultation with researchers around the process of Indigenous researchers doing Indigenous research, around whether there's any things that could be improved within that particular space. I know that there's just been work done around the training program for ethics. I don't know if that's out yet, but I know that we participated in that. So, you know, there are quite a strong group of people that can be called on to provide input in some of these things. So maybe it is worthwhile getting some feedback from researchers around how some of these things could be improved from the administrative perspective, if that's helpful. That would probably be the first thing, that would, you know, talk to people, see how it's working as a group. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, just building on that, the thought that springs to mind from the conversations that you've had in the work that you've done is maybe the, you know, the written format of completing forms with information. Maybe that doesn't best serve what we're trying to achieve in this area. And maybe what might be better would be to have time to sort of like converse with the researchers who are interested, so you can get a sort of better understanding and knowledge could be shared.
Yeah.
But look,
yeah. mindful of time as
Yeah.
well, everyone. Happy to have a chat. Amanda, I'm here. I'm around. Thank you very much for coming along, everyone, those in the room and those online, and for staying on a little bit over time for the Q&A. I hope you found the session today useful, and I popped my email up before. So it's r24.cook@qut.edu.au. If you missed it, feel free to reach out, have a chat. More than happy to talk about it with people further. Thank you very much.
Thank you on behalf of everyone who's been here in the room and everyone online. We want to thank you for what you've shared with us today and the great work that you're doing. It's been a real treat and a wonderful way to celebrate NAIDOC Week. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and enjoy NAIDOC, everyone. Thank you.